Thank you.
Call Dr. Megan Woods.
Speaker. And often I begin my contributions in this House by saying it's my pleasure to take a call on a piece of legislation, and it's not my pleasure, Mr Speaker, to take this call, acknowledging that we're here only such a short period of time after this primary legislation was passed, and we're back here amending it to bring it into force earlier than any of us ever hoped it would have to be used. And I would like to extend my condolences to the family and friends and the communities of the people who died in the recent earthquakes. They're a very difficult time for communities to get through, and it is our job as lawmakers to make sure that the right laws are in place to make this as easy a time as possible for local communities. Mr Speaker, I'd like to also extend our sincere thanks and support to the emergency workers and responders and members of the public who have been working tirelessly in the communities impacted by these earthquakes, because we know so much of the civil defence emergency response is around those people in communities working at that very local level, making sure that people are looked after. I'd also like to acknowledge the cross-party work that has got us back and got us into the House so quickly to pass this amending legislation. That the Minister, the Acting Minister of Civil Defence, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, has worked well across parties to bring people together and to talk about this legislation, and I think this is an example of this Parliament working well. And other speakers have traversed that what we are doing with this law is bringing into play earlier, getting royal assent for a bill that was passed only, I think it was on the 10th of November, Mr Speaker. But in addition to bringing that legislation forward, some other very important provisions are made, and I think that's something that has been once again brought to light by an earthquake sequence. We certainly saw it in the experience in Canterbury, in terms of the need to make sure that the buildings that people are living and working in are safe. And at present, Mr Speaker, the only real legislative levers that we have to ensure that buildings are inspected are health and safety laws. And what this legislation does is brings into play an additional clause, Clause 11, which inserts the transitional provisions for the bill, which makes it optional for territorial authorities to implement the mandatory requirements of the bill and around recovery managers. So it's the need to inspect properties that is absolutely paramount here. Because what we also need to see is what Labor has previously called for these powers to require assessments to be undertaken. And we're very pleased to see these put into this bill. That we have a patchwork of local government trying to cope with a disaster when it happens, and how it is that it can inspect its own properties, its own public spaces and its own public buildings, but the ability for them to require private properties to be inspected hasn't been there. So it's very pleasing to see that provision. We know that we've seen here in Wellington with the effects of the quake, there is going to be a need for this. That there have been a number of government buildings that have been shown to need to be cordoned off and the public not to enter them. It's now the public need reassurance that all buildings are going to be safe. Really, the only power that local authorities have been able to have beyond inspecting their own buildings is to use the cordon. And the cordon is something that a council can put in place, keeping the public out of whole areas. But, Mr Speaker, it is much more satisfactory that we would go in and do the assessments of those buildings. I, like many people that sleep at night in an apartment building here in Wellington, would like to see the safety inspection certificate for the building that I'm spending time in, and to know that that building is safe. And I'm sure that is not something that I am alone on. But, Mr Speaker, it's not only the buildings that we've seen here in Wellington that we can see that there is real risk and that some of those buildings have been working on, but we also have the findings of the Royal Commission of what went wrong with buildings in Canterbury, most notably the CTV building and what happened there. And that is where we saw the failure of a building, and there was the cost of lives. because this is of the most serious nature that we're talking about here. We're not talking about red tape and a bureaucracy. What we're talking about is our role as lawmakers to ensure we're putting the right rules in place so that people's lives are not unduly lost in the case of a disaster. And we have this opportunity here with this bill to do that. So, Mr Speaker, Labor is very happy to support this legislation, bringing into force legislation that we had already passed. So it is pleasing to see that that work had already been done, that the Parliament had already grappled with those questions, it had gone through and had a good consultation at the Select Committee process, and now we have the opportunity to add to that to ensure that here in Wellington that the buildings can be made more safe. So, Mr Speaker, Labor is happy to support this bill.